This is the Cortex Athletic Review. I'm your host, Evan Carrillo, and each week I dive into the research to distill and relate sports science and psychological peer-reviewed literature to modern-day coaching and athletic development with a slight bias to hockey goaltenders. Episode 28. Good to be back in the chair. Let's begin. For the next number of weeks, I don't know how long this is going to stretch out, but my idea was to take a step backwards almost and look at some of the more foundational research ideas and the landmark studies in the sports science world. So within this, there would be things like Anders Ericsson with his idea of deliberate practice, and that's sort of where the 10,000 hour rule stemmed from. Another one would be like the Yerkes-Dodson bell curve law. They have an arousal performance relationship that is often cited in the sports science area. So that'll be the plan, just this sort of foundations mini-series to revisit some of these ideas that current sports science research would have eventually built off of. Before we launch into this week's paper, I just have a couple of shout-outs that I wanted to get out there. The first goes to Nathan Park and Connor Monday. They run a goalie development program called True North Goaltending up here in the Edmonton area. They also have a podcast called the DIY Goalie Podcast, which is presented by True North Goaltending. I've been lucky enough to be a guest on their show 2 times now. The first was around this time last year, maybe in the spring last year, and then just recently a couple of weeks ago. I've always had a good time joining this show. I've always been really grateful for Nathan and Connor to have me on as a guest. So if you are looking for some more goalie-related content, check out the DIY Goalie Podcast. It is available on all platforms. The other shout-out that I want to give is to a longtime coach and friend of mine named Adam Surgery. Anybody that knows him calls him Surge, but he and I first started coaching together about 11 years ago now, just in the minor hockey scene in the Edmonton area. And he has been on this crazy upward trajectory after we coached a number of years at the U18 and U15 AAA levels here. He moved on to a role with the Sherwood Park Crusaders, then AJHL, now the BCHL Junior League in Alberta. The last year and a half or so, last full season, he was a director of scouting with the Penticton Vs, now of the WHL. And now that it's been released on a social media post and a post on the website for the Penticton Vs, it was announced that he will be leaving that job as he had accepted a new role with the Vancouver Canucks. I'm not sure if it was announced exactly what his role was, so that's as far as I'll go into that, but it is a hockey operations role with the Canucks. Serge, congratulations, buddy. It's been awesome to watch you rise and rise and rise in this hockey world, and I've also enjoyed being a part of it as he's kind of pulled me along with a couple of assignments in the AJHL and BCHL and WHL with some scouting. So all the best, despite the fact that you're kind of putting me in a weird spot here with not wanting the Vancouver Canucks to be terrible anymore. I actually want them to do quite well, and coming from an Edmonton guy, that's something. So congrats, buddy, and all the best. I can't wait to see what you do here. Let's get into the show. So for the first foundations, we're going to go all the way back to 1975. This was the year the journal Psychological Review first published a crazy new idea by a University of Southern California researcher named Richard Schmidt. Schmidt at the time was asking the same question that a lot of other athletics researchers were asking, and that was how people like athletes learn and perform the movement. Now, I know the smart-ass response is going to be something like, well, they practice. But in this area, remember, it's much, much more of a psychological mechanism that the researchers at the time are interested in. The actual title of this paper is called A Schema Theory of Discrete Motor Skill Learning. Again, published in July of 1975 and copyrighted by the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. The big idea with this theory is the idea of schemas. And to just give that a little bit of context before diving into the real academic mumbo jumbo of it, think of a schema as a general set of rules or guidelines or parameters that you can follow to solve a new type of movement solution. As a really crude and non-athletic example, schemas are what allows you to order a coffee from a brand new McDonald's or Starbucks that you've never been through before, despite the fact that you don't know exactly how that parking lot and that drive-thru is organized. We have this schema, this mental representation, this set of rules and patterns about how drive-thrus typically work that allows us to adapt to a slightly new layout in that moment while we're solving this new movement solution. In this case, it's just finding some caffeine and exactly where to go and where to steer your car. This unfamiliar drive-thru does not need to be identical to the one that you usually visit or to something that you've previously visited. It just needs to share enough underlying relationships and patterns. Richard Schmidt's Schema Theory asks kind of the same thing. It asks whether movement works in a similar way. So if you think of an athlete swinging a baseball bat or swinging a golf club or a gymnast on a balance beam or any other number of athletic movement problems, it asks, can we generate a new action by applying a general rule rather than recalling or retrieving an exact copy of something that we have done before from our stored memory? I've pulled out this quote before in previous episodes. It basically goes that good artists will borrow ideas where great artists will steal ideas. The schema idea was not new from Richard Schmidt. It actually existed way back in 1932 from Frederick Bartlett. In this case, he introduced this schema concept with his work on memory. To put it really shortly, Bartlett argued that memory is not just simply a collection of exact recordings, where we like to think of our memory as kind of a video recording and video playback sometimes. Bartlett was one of the first to say that no, that's not the case here. We actually abstract general patterns from past experiences and use them to interpret or reconstruct new ones. And this is where later work like Elizabeth Loftus on eyewitness memory comes into play, how even previous experiences can kind of blend into each other and just creates this whole memory mess. Schmidt took that schema and organized framework idea and applied that to movement, saying that maybe we don't need to store every single movement as some kind of program in our brain, some kind of motor program, which I'll hit in a little bit here. Instead, what we're probably doing is retaining these general relationships, these general patterns that allow us to construct an appropriate movement when it's needed, even though it may be a brand new situation. This would be a good time to say that just because this is a foundational paper, it does not mean that everything in this paper has held up and has been widely considered as true. In a lot of cases, these foundational papers, much of them was disproved or found to be complete nonsense, but the foundational papers kind of need to exist in the first place for this later research to build off of. In this case, one of the limitations of Schmidt's schema theories was that his paper specifically focused on discrete motor skills. So those would be skills like starting and stopping a routine. This routine or this movement has a specific start point and a specific end point. That could be like winding up for a pitch in baseball. So with that, if you find yourself in a continuous movement or a continuous scenario like a basketball or hockey or even a football play where you have to adjust to something that is unfamiliar really, really quickly, this schema theory in this paper at least wasn't really designed to cover that. So while Schmidt was busy stealing Bartlett's schema ideas, you could say that he was motivated from this other idea, Adams' closed loop theory. This guy Adams, he was a different researcher altogether, and he proposed that a memory trace is the thing that initiates the movement, this kind of shadow or forecasting idea of what this correct movement should feel like. Now, obviously, this would have to happen really, really quickly. and would be a lot harder to explain and describe a movement if you're going off of something like memory trace. This kind of rings to me like using the force. The stronger your force is, the better this movement accuracy will be. The idea was that during movement, sensory feedback is compared with this force or perceptual trace so that errors can be detected and corrected. And this would suggest that the errors have to be detected and corrected on the fly, kind of as this movement is happening. It's easy to see some holes in that as I'm kind of having some fun with here, but Schmidt saw some value in this and used it to explain how feedback could guide his movement and how practice might improve just this error detection. That was the important part, was this ability to self-assess. And as you're in the middle of a motion, say winding up to pitch a baseball, that if you were a little bit off in one way as the movement was happening, that in theory you would be better and better at detecting this error and then correcting it as it was happening. Now, there's some obvious limitations with this closed loop theory from Adams. A couple would be like, if you're a beginner and your movement is pretty much all errors, then where does this perceptual trace even come from? Yet people can obviously learn from a lot of these unsuccessful attempts. There's also this idea of storage. If every single movement requires its own memory or own perceptual trace or its own force, our nervous systems would have to basically be able to hold an infinite, unlimited number of these perceptual traces to basically instantaneously call upon during some kind of movement. Likewise, there's this idea of novelty and this novelty problem where people and these elite performers often produce brand new movements that they've never done before. And in goaltending specifically, like you see this all the time. The position is basically consisting of specific scenarios that you've probably never seen an exact copy of before, and you may never see an exact copy of ever again. And that includes stopping a puck that's coming at you at 45 miles per hour and stopping a puck that's coming at you at 46 miles per hour. Those are all pretty big problems. The biggest one is probably the feedback problem. And it's that feedback takes some time to process. We are not machines operating off of code. A lot of rapid movements are finished before the feedback can even be used to correct them. I mentioned the concept of a motor program before. It's worth defining before I move on. A motor program is a pre-organized set of movement commands that can produce an action without needing a lot of sensory feedback to direct every part of it. So just think of it like we have a motor program for throwing a baseball. A professional Major League Baseball pitcher would have a really robust and strong motor program for delivering that pitch. A hockey player has a motor program for taking a snapshot. An NFL quarterback has a motor program for throwing a ball. A receiver has one for catching it. But again, there's some limitations and some problems with this. The biggest is that it would just be impossible to store all of the motor programs that we needed, even just to get through a normal day of walking, driving a car, walking upstairs, stuff like that. It would just be impossible to store one motor program per required movement that we needed. Schmidt took the good parts from that and created a generalized motor program theory. Instead of storing each and every single movement that would be required, and organize them into classes or categories of related actions. It still preserves the underlying structure of the actions, but it just gives them adjustable parameters now. You can adjust the speed or the force or the duration of the movement instead of having a separate motor program that is responsible for each and every single one of these little tiny differences. With this idea of the generalized motor program, after you perform a movement, there are things that you would learn, some feedback with how successful you were or how the movement felt. Schmidt proposed 4 specifically. One looks at the initial conditions, so the state of the body and the environment before moving. What's the starting phase of this movement? Where do you have to be to set yourself up? Then there's the response specifications. which are just the parameters that are assigned to the movement. So how hard you have to throw, how fast, how far, how long you need to jump, stuff like that. After your movement, you have what's called the sensory consequences, and that's where you just reflect and think what that action felt, looked, or sounded like. And then you pair that with the response outcome, which is what that movement actually accomplished. I don't think it's important to memorize or even have a really in-depth understanding of each of those four things separately. You'll end up with an assessment that basically just goes, where was I starting? What did I do? What did it feel like? And then what happened? Did I get the desired result from that movement? Each attempt at that movement, so each pitch or each jump or even each step up the stairs, whatever you're doing, would then contribute another example to that developing schema that each person has.
Saving grace has never hit the same in. I've been running out of blood, yeah. Said I've been running out of blood, yeah. Said I've been running.
So with his work, Schmidt technically proposed two different schemas, but each of them are a part of the same learning system. The first is the recall schema, which is responsible for producing the movement. Think of that like to get me from here to there, or to get this ball from here to there. To get the result that I want, how should I perform this movement? So the technical details of that movement. The second he called a recognition schema, and that predicts what that movement should feel or look like or sound like if it produced that intended result. So you can almost kind of tie in some imagery to this. The reason why we are able to use mental imagery before, say, making a free throw shot at the line, you can imagine making that shot as a basketball player and what that release, what that follow through, what that ball trajectory or arc, what the sound, what it should feel like, all that stuff before going into it. And you can do that because you have a schema of this ideal free throw shot. In simpler terms, just to sum those two up, if the movement was right, what should it have felt like? Together, these two schemas, the recognition schema and the recall schema, allow an athlete to generate and evaluate a movement without having previously performed that exact version. And that's important because we're going to be in these brand new situations all the time. So far, this idea of schemas and schema theory is sounding a little bit more realistic, at least. That's all terrific stuff, but I still think at the end of the day, we have to be able to apply it. So my coaching brain would immediately go to something like during a practice, stopping a drill partway through and maybe going up to the athlete and just asking, hey, what are you doing well? What do you feel so far? And just drawing some attention inwards to what this movement feels like. Especially younger athletes are going to be really lacking this recognition schema. If they are learning a skill for the very first time, they're not going to have a really good idea of what that movement should feel like yet. So I think as a coach, this is where it would be important to highlight that. And positive reinforcement, it's, everybody feels good and motivation and stuff like that. But this would perhaps be an example where pointing out something that they've done well, just to kind of lock into their framework, their mental framework that, oh, this is a little bit closer to the optimal form. That's what that rep or that's what that skill or that movement should have felt like. So that would be my suggestion just as a coach. I'm sure there are many others there too. So just to circle back, and this does have some shades of that Bayesian reasoning as well, way back in episode 2, I think it was. A performer identifies a goal and reads a situation. The recall schema kind of digs up the generalized motor program that might be needed for this. The program actually produces the action. The performer or athlete or person walking up a set of stairs experiences the resulting sensations and observes the outcome. Those sensations, especially if it's intentionally brought to the athlete's forefront, are compared with what the recognition schema predicted it should have felt like. And then the relationships from that attempt are then used to refine both of those different schemas. The other nice thing about this is that you can be really intentional and deliberate with errors as a tool to produce this learning. Even if you're not explicitly coaching something, if you are doing something as mundane as walking up a set of stairs, and it's not an athletic act, it's more just an everyday movement solution that people need to solve. A missed attempt, if you just don't lift your leg up high enough and you catch your toe on the front of a stair, that error still gives you information about perhaps what went wrong. In this case, you just know that you didn't lift your foot up high enough because it gives you immediate feedback, and then you would just correct that for your future steps. Maybe an unintended consequence with going back with some of these more foundational researchers is that you can often see how different theories intermingle here. So, also in this one is something called variability of practice. And there's a really cool example that comes from a book called Make It Stick that was actually one of the biggest influences into my teaching and classroom practices, and definitely a lot of my coaching practices as well. There was an experiment that was done in that book where participants had to, I think it was they were throwing a beanbag, and they were trying to hit this target that was 5 feet away. And in one condition, they had a bunch of people throwing this beanbag at the exact distance of 5 feet. And in another condition, they had participants throwing it at variable distances. So one would be 3 feet, one was 4 feet, the next throw was 6 feet, the next throw was 5 feet, the next throw was 4 feet, and so on. The distances were really, really variable. And what they found was that the real blocked practice, that one specific distance, that 5-foot condition, practicing that exact parameter was actually much less effective than this variable practice where the distances were actually changing. I don't remember the exact percentage, but the participants in this variable condition were significantly more accurate with hitting that 5-foot toss when it came time to be tested. Schmidt actually speaks to this in his schema theory that repeating only one version of some action provides a lot of information about a really, really narrow point in this movement relationship. On the flip side, practicing a whole bunch of different versions of that shows the learner how changing the parameters actually changes the outcomes. And I think that's why those beanbag tossers were able to be more successful, is they just learned a little bit more about those relationship parameters. They had a good idea of how the force scaled from a 4-foot throw to a 5-foot throw to a 6-foot throw, and were just more fluent with their force outcome relationships, and were eventually able to hit that target distance a lot more accurately. Schmidt again extends this, saying that it's the variable practice condition, or variable practice in general, that should improve the ability to produce an unpracticed variation later. So especially in open skill sports where your environment is constantly changing in front of you, pretty much everything that you see is going to require some unpracticed variation. There's just so much that's changing, it's impossible to practice every single variation that you're going to see, and where this variability of practice seems to be a lot more valuable. Remember how earlier Richard Schmidt proposed the two different parts, the recall schemas and the recognition schemas? A rather important development with Schmidt's theory is that these two schemas do not necessarily develop at the same rate, and they can actually be split. You may have somebody that's just really good at picking up a movement without being really good at judging it or assessing their ability at it, and somebody else that might recognize or be really analytical about exactly what they're doing wrong, but they're just unable to produce the correct movement. The fact that these two things are separate, I think, strengthens this schema theory. There are some questions left unanswered, or maybe just areas that people don't necessarily agree upon. Say, for example, you get really good at throwing with your right arm. What happens now if you start trying to throw with your left hand? Are you creating a brand new motor program or new parameters of that existing program? That's a bit of a gray area in this. You also have this continuum effect. So at what point along this movement does it become so structurally different to require a different generalized motor program? Schmidt and schema theory don't really have a good answer to that. For me, that's okay. I don't expect a theory to be all-encompassing, but these foundational theories, again, are important to build off of for later works. The idea with this is not to try and sell anybody on schema theory or not to sell anybody on variable practice, although I do think that is just good practice. Schemas are something that allows movements to be generated without storing every possible version of it in that athlete's brain somewhere. It also allows people to generate new actions and even non-athletes. Again, you can give the example of walking up an unfamiliar set of stairs with a brand new rise and run that you've never encountered before. You can adapt your movement pretty easily based on past experience of how to deal with stairs and then just adapting on the fly. If you do make an error, you do hit your toe on the end, those errors do contribute to that learning. And it gives a good framework for how athletes could generally learn to produce movements and recognize their own errors by having those two different recognition and recall schemas. As this theory moved on in the sports science literature, the mechanisms were often questioned and then revised and sometimes replaced later on. But still, for those revisions, which is just an improvement upon the original, that's not able to happen without the original. So if anybody is pioneering a brand new theory in something, even if it turns out to have a pretty short half-life and be completely disproven and be completely revised and replaced as it goes, it is still important that it existed in the first place in order for those revisions to happen. So schema theory, it's important, and it's not because Schmidt had every single one of these mechanisms exactly right way back in 1975. But he gave the sports science literature, or more specifically, the movement generation world, a testable way to think about how experience becomes adaptable movement, and offered a new framework to that had just never been proposed before. That does it for this week's episode. New episodes are going to continue to come out every 2 weeks as we explore this Foundations mini-series. You can listen in wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube at the channel Cortex Goaltender Development. I think that's pretty much it. All of the information that you might need is in the description and the show notes. Feel free to reach out if you want to have a discussion. Thank you very much to those who have done so already. My name is Evan Carrillo. This is the Cortex Athletic Review. Thanks for listening, and stay out of your own way.